It was 3:40 p.m. in the afternoon. I was ordering food in a restaurant in China, and I couldn't believe the attitude. 不要跟我讲方言，跟我讲中文。Bruh, this is Guangzhou. I was speaking Cantonese, which is Chinese. But this is something that Cantonese people have been dealing with all their lives. Even in Chinese school, growing up, teachers would actually forbid us 85 million Cantonese people from writing the way we spoke. But why would a waiter in Canton, China believe that Cantonese isn't Chinese? And why do so many Chinese people believe the same thing? My team and I dedicated over 30 hours of intense research, combining over 600 pages of Chinese history over the last 2 months to completely dismantle this misconception that Cantonese isn't Chinese. Because here's the thing, Cantonese didn't just appear out of nowhere in the south of China. Its history goes way, way back, like ancient dynasties back. See, while Mandarin, the main language of China today, and what is widely considered to be Chinese, evolved and shifted, especially in the north of China, Cantonese in the south held on tight to the old ways of speaking. In fact, if we rewind even further, all the way back to the Zhou dynasty, back then there was an official language called Ngāyin, or Yayan, or elegant speech. This wasn't just any old dialect. Ngāyin was the prestige form of Chinese used at royal courts, in government, and by scholars. Even Confucius himself. Yep, that Confucius. He taught his students using Ngāyin. In fact, it was actually considered the proper way to speak for centuries, or the standard Chinese at that time. But what does this have to do with Cantonese being the closest living link to ancient Chinese and Cantonese being Chinese? Well, here's the crazy part. Remember how I said that Ngāyin was pretty much considered standard Chinese at that time? Well, Cantonese actually still preserves many features of Ngāyin that Mandarin has completely lost. After Qin unified Lingnan or Lingnan, which is the south of the Nanling Mountains, Ngāyin was brought by 500,000 immigrants from the Central Plains, Zhongyuan, and it became the earliest source of Cantonese. During the Han Dynasty, Confucianism spread in Lingnan, and Ngāyin gradually became popular through the establishment of schools. But during the Qin and Han Dynasties, the Pearl River Delta region, or what's called like the region that houses like Hong Kong, Macau, and Guangzhou, like the main parts of that speak Cantonese, that whole region was still sparsely populated until a large number of immigrants moved south from the Central Plains to the Pearl River Delta during the Tang and Song dynasties. And this began the formation of Cantonese, my culture, which brought the Central Plains pronunciation of the Tang and Song dynasties. Therefore, this was actually when modern-day Cantonese began to kind of slowly form. So, how does that relate to modern-day Cantonese being close to ancient Chinese? I mean, this was thousands of years ago. How do we even know what ancient Chinese even sounded like? Well, we'll get to that in a bit. But what you have to know is that China has a very long history of war with neighbors, but Guangdong had basically no war and was not affected by war, so it managed to preserve the language and culture of the Han and Tang dynasty periods. This is why the speech system of Cantonese today has an extremely complete correspondence with the speech system of the Qin and Han dynasties. In fact, the first rhyme dictionary in ancient China compiled by the government, Guangyun, or broad rhymes, shows that the pronunciation of the text marked in it is very consistent with that of Cantonese, which we'll explore that in a bit. But Mandarin now, which is known as the official language or the official Chinese, according to that waiter, was first recorded much later than Cantonese in the 14th century Yuan dynasty in China. And remember how I said China has always been in war? Well, since the north of China had been ruled by foreign races such as the Khitan, Mongolia, and Jurchen, since the end of the Tang dynasty, the northern dialect was actually influenced by a lot of foreign languages, which made it lose a lot of characteristics of Chinese and introduced a lot of foreign accents. And so you'll see that in the rhyme shortly. But it's wild when you think about it. Cantonese today isn't just some modern twist on Chinese. It's carrying sounds, tones, and vocabulary that reach all the way back to when Confucius was still walking the earth. Even the everyday words we use in Cantonese, the casual stuff, the way we joke, the way we complain about things, a lot of it comes straight from ancient Chinese texts. Let's dive into a few examples. You're gonna see just how deep these roots really go. First, the famous poem from Song Dynasty, 苏轼收息水調歌頭水調歌頭. In it, there's a line, first in Cantonese, 明月幾時有把酒問青天. Now in Mandarin, 明月幾時有把酒問青天. When will the moon be clear and bright? With a cup of wine in my hand, I ask the clear sky. That line in there, 幾時, is Cantonese, meaning when, as in asking what time. In Mandarin, we don't ask when like that. We either say 何时 or 什么时候. You would never hear 几时 in Mandarin. It's strange. Let's look at another example, similar to Gacy, another Song-Dynasty poem written by Lei Yok or Li Yu in Mandarin. This is the name in Mandarin. 虞美人春花秋月何时了? Or in Cantonese, 虞美人，春花秋月何時了? The line goes, 問君能有幾多愁，恰似一江春水向東流. Or in Mandarin, 問君能有幾多愁，恰似一江春水向東流. How much sorrow do I have? It is like the spring flood of a long river flowing east. 幾多 is also a Cantonese word that means how many or how much. In Mandarin, it would actually be 多少. They don't say 幾多 or 幾多 in Mandarin. They don't use that. Here's another poem from Su Shi or So Sick. 雨前僧侶遠霜. Or in Cantonese, 於前僧綠雲軒. In that poem it goes, at Monk Yu Tian's green bamboo grove. In it writes, 寧可食無肉，不可知無竹. You would rather eat no meat than live without bamboos. 寧可食無肉，不可居無竹. Sik means eat, and it's exactly how we say eat in Cantonese nowadays. While in Mandarin they use the word 吃, which is a lot more common. They don't use that word sik to mean to eat in Mandarin. And honestly, the words alone would already be pretty impressive, but here's where it gets even crazier. It's not just the vocabulary that survived. The way we pronounce these words in Cantonese is also way closer to how people actually spoke in ancient times. In fact, going back to our Eminem and Enrique Iglesias Latin rhyme battle from earlier, if you compare ancient Chinese poetry with modern Cantonese pronunciation, you'll notice that the rhyme schemes, the flow and rhythm, still make sense in Cantonese, while in Mandarin, they often sound totally off. It's like with Cantonese, we still have the original musical notes of the language, while Mandarin kind of rewrote the whole song. Cantonese, with its rich tonal system and phonetic structure, often preserves the original rhymes and rhythms of ancient Chinese poetry much better than Mandarin does. So what exactly am I talking about? Let's dive into the examples below and explore how Cantonese brings these classic poems to life in a way that Mandarin simply can't. Let's look at some examples. A poem by Tang Dynasty poet Du Fu or Dou Fu, Chun Wang, or in Cantonese, Chun Wang. First, let's read the poem in Mandarin. 国破山河在，城春草木深。感时花溅泪，恨别鸟惊心。烽火连三月，家书抵万金。白头搔更短，浑欲不勝簪. Okay, now in Cantonese. 國破山河在，城春草木深。感時花溅淚，恨別鳥驚心。烽火連三月，家書抵萬金。白頭搔更短，渾欲不勝簪. This is an example of 近體詩 or 近體詩. Regulated verse is a strict and formal style of Chinese poetry that kind of emerged in the Tang Dynasty. It's characterized by specific rules governing line length, tone patterns, and rhyme schemes. But what you need to know is that, just like any kind of poetry ever, the rhyme is simply placed at the end of every even line, and the rhyme must be consistent throughout the poem. It's kind of like a rap song, right? So let's first try to read the words that are supposed to rhyme in Mandarin. Shen, xin, jin, zan. I mean, you don't need to be a rapper like Eminem to know that these don't rhyme, right? Shen and xin don't rhyme. So right away we see that it doesn't show how 近体诗, regulated verse, is supposed to be. Mandarin fails the rhyme test. But now let's read it in Cantonese. Sum sum gum zam. Oh yeah, your boy's a rapper now. Hey, rhymes, baby. Now everything makes sense, right? Sum sum and gum zam clearly rhymes as it should. Better analogy is a Cantonese person reading that is Kendrick, and a Mandarin person reading that is Drake. If you know, you know. And I'm from Toronto. Here's another example of a poem called 燈冠雀樓 by Wang Jiwen, or 燈冠雀樓 Wang Zhihuan. This time I'll let Cantonese Kendrick go first. 白日依山盡，黃河入海流，欲窮千里目，更上一層樓. We see once again this is an example of 近體詩, regulated verse. As mentioned earlier, the rhyme is supposed to be placed at the end of every even line. For this case, as you can already tell, 樓 and 樓 are pronounced the same, making them rhyme, right? Now let's have Mandarin Drake go at it and see if it rhymes, okay? Now Mandarin. 白日依山盡，黃河入海流，欲窮千里目，更上一層樓. Well, I mean, sorry, Mandarin Drake. Liu and Lo do not rhyme in Mandarin. Looks like Mandarin Drake lost again. So now that we've established that Cantonese has a long history, it's clear that it holds a stronger connection to ancient Chinese. But what exactly is it that makes Cantonese sound so much closer to classical Chinese compared to other modern Chinese dialects like Mandarin? Why does it seem to preserve the ancient rhythms, tones, and pronunciation so well? To understand this, we need to dive a bit deeper into the Cantonese tonal system and how it functions. How does this system maintain sounds and structures that were once common in ancient Chinese, but have been lost or simplified in other dialects? To truly appreciate why Cantonese sounds so much closer to ancient Chinese, we need to first understand how its tonal system works. Because unlike Mandarin, which only has 4 tones, Cantonese is up to 9 depending on the region. But what does this mean and why is it important? In Cantonese, first off, there are traditionally 6 tones in the open syllables, so those without a final consonant. We'll get into the final 3 for that in a bit. But basically, these 6 tones can be further divided into level tones and oblique tones. And this tonal variety allows for a greater distinction between words, similar to how, classical Chinese had a wide variety of rhymes and sounds that kind of differentiate meanings. For example, the syllable si can mean silk, si, history, si, or to try, si, time, si, city, si, or matter, si, depending on the tone used. This makes Cantonese more complex, but it also allows it to preserve a greater variety of sounds, just as classical Chinese did. But the key point here is that Cantonese tones are more similar to the tonal patterns of classical Chinese than Mandarin tones are. See, Mandarin has undergone simplifications over the centuries, reducing the number of tones and shifting the tone system to become more standardized. And so as a result, there's just certain sounds that were in ancient Chinese that just don't exist in Mandarin today. Cantonese, on the other hand, has kept much of its complexity, which helps preserve the musicality and richness of ancient Chinese pronunciation. And that's not all! Cantonese isn't just hanging on to those 6 tones, it's also keeping another ancient treasure alive. And there's those last 3 now, something called entering tones, or yapsing. The 7th, 8th, and 9th tones of Cantonese are what we call yapsing, which are tones that end in a plosive consonant, kind of like P, T, or K, kind of like book, or like pot, or like pop. These entering tones were part of classical Chinese but were lost in Mandarin over time, making Cantonese an even closer match to ancient pronunciations. How do we know this? How do we even know what ancient Chinese sounded like? We're almost there. For example, the words da, go, sek, and Cantonese all have a very strong ending sound that would have been used in classical Chinese but is no longer present in Mandarin. But hold on, Sheldon, wait, this all sounds like a stretch here. I get that the rhymes make it clear that ancient Chinese were closer to Cantonese, but how do we even know what classical Chinese sounded like? The language is thousands of years old. How do we know it had a strong ending sound? Well, how we know exactly what ancient Chinese sounded like is another video on its own, but here's a quick breakdown of kind of how we know. We use the connection between Cantonese and other Sino-Xenic languages like Korean and Japanese. If you watch our video, Why Korea and Japan Stole Chinese Characters, you'll learn that back when the written Chinese characters were kind of first imported into Japan and Korea, they didn't just pick up random pronunciations, they adopted the ancient Chinese pronunciations. Because obviously this was ages ago, right? That's right. So both Japanese and Korean still preserve these older pronunciations in many of their characters. So let's take an easy example. How do we say China in these languages? Well, in Korea, it's Jongok. In Japanese, it's Chugok. These pronunciations both have that ancient K sound, or that plosive thing we talked about in the end. The same sound you'll hear in the Cantonese version, Zhongguo. But you won't hear it in Mandarin. Mandarin's Zhongguo doesn't have that final plosive sound. So we can infer that the older pronunciations, like what Cantonese still uses today, are actually closer to how the characters were spoken in ancient Chinese. So now why does this even matter, right? Well, it shows that not only did Cantonese preserve much of the ancient sounds, but also that other languages like Japanese and Korean were also using them. So Cantonese acts like a time capsule, holding on to the way ancient Chinese was pronounced, while Mandarin over the years, unfortunately, has shifted slowly away from these ancient sounds. So when we look at modern pronunciations of China across different languages, it's not just about Cantonese sounding more traditional, it's about Cantonese being a closer representation of how Chinese sounded back when these characters were first coined in the first place. The fact that Korean and Japanese still reflect these old pronunciations shows just how far these roots go back, and how Cantonese is a key player in preserving that connection to ancient Chinese. In fact, on top of the rhymes, one of the most striking features of Cantonese is that the tones correspond closely with how ancient Chinese poetry and literature would have sounded. And this is thanks to that yapseng. The rhythm and rhyme of Tang Dynasty poetry, for example, can be better appreciated when recited in Cantonese because the tonal patterns reflect more accurately the phonetic structure of classical Chinese, once again thanks to those yapsengs. Oh, yapsengs. But now, why does Mandarin not preserve the tones? As you mentioned earlier, right? Mandarin, which is once again known as the official language, or according to the waiter and a bunch of other Chinese people, the only Chinese, was first recorded much later than Cantonese in the Yuan dynasty in China. And so during the Yuan dynasty, the Yuan government compiled the Zhongyuan Yinyun, or Zhongyun Yamwan, rhymes of the Central Plain, but based on Mongolian, replacing the original Guangyun, broad rhymes, and assign the entering tone to the other 3 tones. So now Mandarin has no more entering tones, yapseng or rusheng in Mandarin, making the tonal structure of Mandarin very different from ancient Chinese. And since then, Mandarin has lost much more phonetic changes than Cantonese. That's why if you actually watch our video on why Chinese hates one-syllable words, Mandarin had to increase the number of syllables from the original Chinese vocabulary by adding in words like zi. Because even though hai or xie mean shoe in both Cantonese and Mandarin, Mandarin doesn't have enough tones to make it clearly differentiable, so we have to say 鞋子 in Mandarin. We have to add that extra word there to kind of indicate, hey, this is a shoe, rather than just in Cantonese or ancient Chinese where it was just hi. So now in short, Cantonese maintains a diverse tonal system that includes sounds and tonal distinctions that are lost in Mandarin. And so this not only makes Cantonese like a more complex and nuanced language, but also makes it a closer approximation of how ancient Chinese was spoken, especially when compared to Mandarin's, simplified and standardized system. And so to that waiter, this should be proof that Cantonese is closer to real Chinese or ancient Chinese. And I'll say to the waiter or to any kind of person who's more Mandarin watching this is I don't hate Mandarin. In fact, I love Mandarin. My team teaches Mandarin to Cantonese speakers, but I do love Cantonese more. And so to all my Cantonese friends, the next time some stupid ignorant jerk tells you Cantonese is not Chinese, you tell them to shut up, Mandarin Drake. I'm Cantonese Kendrick. And if you don't get the reference and they don't get the reference and they're older or whatever, just tell them to shut up anyway and send this video. Alright, hope you guys know the video. Now click here if you're a Cantonese speaker who wants to learn Mandarin or improve your Cantonese, and click here for a video that YouTube thinks you'll love. 再见.